We are here to talk with Angela Duckworth on grit, passions, perseverance, and Parkinson's. And I'm so honored to be here. I told Angela when we were getting ready, I've been a fangirl for years and years and years. So this is a really big honor for me to be able to talk to you. Davis and Connie, Phinney are here. Thank you so much for being here to watch this as well. We're going to be talking about grit and how we handle adversity in our lives, which is certainly true for people who have been given a Parkinson's diagnosis. Before we get started, I just want to thank our peak partners, Adamas, Amneal, Lundbeck, and Synovian. Thank you for supporting our educational content and for making it possible for us to provide education in lots of different ways for free to our community. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Angela. She is a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, author of the book Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. She has a TED Talk that has been viewed over 20 million times. She has a podcast with Stephen Dubner called No Stupid Questions, which incidentally is how I got Angela to do this. I said, no stupid questions. I'm going to ask you to join us for our webinars. She was very gracious to say yes. She's also the founder and CEO of Character Lab, and we will be sure to put up all of those links for you today so you can check out more with Angela. So again, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Bill. I'm really excited for this conversation. I'm, somebody whose own family's been touched with Parkinson's. I'm happy to elaborate. And so when I got the invitation, I thought, well, I can't say no.
Love it. I love that. So do you want to share a little bit about what your connection is to Parkinson's?
Yeah, briefly. And my PhD has nothing to do with medical science, so I won't be answering questions. I actually have questions about Parkinson's, but I certainly can't answer any from a medical perspective. My dad, who's not with us anymore, but he had a Parkinson's diagnosis really for probably the last 2 decades of his life. And he lived to, a very healthy 87. So he had a very good run. And actually, we lost him at the very beginning of the pandemic. He was, quite frail from a number of different conditions, including Parkinson's, but actually several other things that he had going on. And anyway, so I certainly see the relevance to the research on behavior change and grit, not only for the Parkinson's patient, but also for the family and the caregivers for the loved one.
Great, thanks. So let's talk about this. Why grit? How did you get to studying grit? What led you down that path?
Well, speaking of my dad, he's really responsible for my research direction because, he raised my sister and my brother and myself. He of course had a partner in this, my mom, but really I think my dad should take the credit for leaving all of us with a kind of an obsession with achievement, because he just talked about it all the time when we were growing up. And, he so admired people who had gone to the Olympics and won medals, or, every year when the Nobel Prizes got announced, he would read to us from the newspaper. And I think that fascination with achievement for my dad went along with a narrative where, like, some people are really gifted and kind of obviously smarter than others, more talented. And he looked at the 3 of us kids and was very candid in saying that we were not the geniuses that, end up winning these prizes later on. And I had a rebellious streak, I think, as a little girl, and I immediately wanted to prove him wrong, which I then spent the professional life as a psychologist, amassing research showing that it's not just your giftedness or your native talent that determines whether you go to the Olympics, win a Nobel Prize, triumph over adversity in your personal life. And in fact, this quality of grit, which is the combination of passion and perseverance over really long periods. So it's a kind of stamina quality that's not correlated at all with measures of IQ or physical talent. So, I felt like my dad was overlooking a really important part of the equation when we talk about achieving our potential or living, certainly leading a meaningful life.
Right, great. So I'm excited to sort of pull apart the idea of the passion and the perseverance. So, because we're going to talk a little bit about exercise and people with Parkinson's. And I know a lot of your work serves as great advice for parents and teachers on how to get kids and students to thrive, especially, if there are people that have just said like, well, I don't have the talent, or I'm not naturally gifted in something. But what can we take from those learnings and apply them to adults, in particular, an adult living with a chronic condition that, they're expected to persist, to persevere, to keep doing things that are difficult. With Parkinson's, it isn't a matter of just let me take a pill and everything's all hunky dory. You actually have to take action every day to live well. So what can we take from that?
Well, the possibility of human beings to unlock stores of energy and motivation, this idea goes all the way back to really 1900. So at that time, there was a psychologist named William James, and he was probably the most prominent psychologist at Harvard University. And he had authored the textbook, Principles of Psychology and so forth. And around the turn of the century, the last century, he wrote this essay called The Energies of Men. And he just made the observation that our motivation and our effort can really actually be so much greater than we at first think is possible. And he talked about, for example, if any of you are familiar with like when you're running and you really feel like you just can't run anymore, or you can't run any faster, and then you get a second wind, right? He actually just used that as a metaphor to say, like, we have, as he put it, like, it's as if we're half awake, like we have stores of energy and stores of motivation that can be released, under the right circumstances. So I think the trick when you're talking about a chronic disease like Parkinson's is that you don't have a sprint, you have a marathon, right? Because it really is like a marathon with no obvious finish line, right? It's longer than 26.2 miles. And so the quality of grit that I study is really, studying people who are able to sustain energy toward goals, not over like a day or a week, but really over an almost indefinite period. And what's remarkable about these women and men, some of whom, yes, go to the Olympics, and some of whom, yes, are Nobel laureates, but I think more importantly are just like the admirable women and men who triumph over challenge in their life, is that it's not the intensity of their motivation, it's the consistency. It's really the stamina with which, so it's not that they, are an 11 out of 10 on motivation and everybody else is a 3 out of 10. It's more that, you come back like the next year and the next year and then 5 years later, and like they have somehow maintained a consistent level of motivation towards something that's very hard. I do want to add this though, and I think for all of you like extremely gritty people, I want you to know that nevertheless, motivation and energy always go up and down. And even for the grittiest of performers, there are good days and there are bad days. And I'll just use myself as a trivial example. So, this last February, like I would just say was like not a great month for me. Like I was like, really not myself. I, didn't sleep well. I wasn't like, exercising. I was like dramatically underproductive. And I was just like, wow, this is a terrible month. And I would not say that, if you dropped into my life at that time, you'd be like, wow, like Angela Duckworth, like she's got it. Like, but the thing that does, I think, make me, somewhat gritty is that I didn't count myself out at the end of February. I wasn't like, well, it's a disaster. Like I'll never, like, it's more like, what was going on in February? I asked questions about like why I wasn't sleeping and like why I didn't feel good. And I was like, you know what? I think the weather is really getting me down. And like, I had to find alternative ways to, get back to routine when it was icy and snowy outside. In other words, if I say that grit is consistency of your passion and perseverance over the long term, I don't want you to come away from this conversation thinking that if you have bad days or you find bumps in the road or you like fall down on your face and you're have a little struggle to get up, like that just makes you human. And every gritty individual that I study, has those bad days too. And as long as you do get up and as long as you learn something from falling down, I think, that's the name of the game.
Yeah, that's such a great point. One of the things we do talk a lot about Parkinson's being a marathon, it's not a sprint. And when I go back and think about, exercise, whether training for triathlons or marathons or whatever, you have this like periodization, right? Like you have different cycles. Unfortunately, Parkinson's has no cycle. There's no point where you're like, okay, and we're sort of hardwired, right, to kind of have a goal and to like meet this thing and then
and to be done.
And then we have another one. And this one is just like, it's never going away. You're gonna wake up every day and have this. And so I think it's a really good point, right? To point out to people, you might have, 5-6 months of you're exercising and it's going and you're doing what you need to do. You might not always love it, but you're getting up to do it. And then you're going to have days where you're like, I can't, I'm too tired or whatever. And don't count yourself out. I talked to somebody this morning who had COVID, he has Parkinson's. And what he's finding is his post-COVID symptoms has been fatigue. And he will, like, this is happening for a lot of people who had COVID, right? But when you had Parkinson's, which you had fatigue anyway, this is really challenging. He's like, I can't get up to walk. I'm not doing those things. But he has a different mindset. He's like, I will get there. I know this is also going to pass. So
yeah, and it's not that we're saying that like strive for inconsistency. We're just saying that like inconsistency and like the ups and downs are, part of the endless marathon. And so don't beat yourself up too much about that. I can give you a couple of ideas for getting yourself out of a rut that are based on new behavioral science. So one thing that helps people is like keeping track. Like Jerry Seinfeld famously, would check off on his calendar every day that he'd like tried to like make up a joke, right? And like he would like try to get these streaks that are longer and longer. And some of you may have this like, already built into routine. So streaks are for many people extremely motivating. You don't even have to get paid. You just have to like have a calendar and you just put X marks on it. And, every time, like day 217, you don't want to break your streak. So it's like, oh, I really don't feel like taking a walk, but like, I don't want to lose 217 days. So streaks are helpful. So if that resonates you, streaks is an idea, but it has to go with this other idea, which is you need a safety. Sometimes we break our streak. And then what we don't want is to feel like, oh, we fell off the wagon and now like we're never going to go walking again because like we just lost 217 days in a streak, et cetera. So what some scientists call these as like emergency reserve days. So you can, an imaginary like currency in your like, it's like you have this like emergency savings. So you can say like, my goal is to have a streak, like the longest possible streak, but I'm going to give myself like 2 emergency savings days, which is like, I'm going to let myself put like 2 X's on this calendar, even if I didn't like go walking that day. And you make that deal with yourself from the very beginning. And that helps a little bit. Like when you fall off the wagon, you're like, I'll just use one of my emergency days. It turns out when researchers study this is that we're very motivated to keep our streak going. And we're very motivated not to like squander our emergency reserve days. So it's basically this trickery that you're playing with yourself. But it can be, helpful, especially when you're talking about the endless marathon, right? Another mental framework that other people find helpful is to just not think about the fact that it's endless. In Alcoholics Anonymous, at least in some chapters, there's a green card, literally a green card. You can Google it. And it says just for today. And, if you are a recovering alcoholic, that too is an endless marathon. And like, if you don't get breaks from it, you're never done. You don't check it off the list, and it's very hard. And so what I think this green card in your wallet reminds you of is that, or like at least gets you to shift your focus to, is like, if you do think of, every day as like an endless marathon, I mean, that itself is exhausting, but you think like, just for today, I won't take a drink, or like, I don't know if I can keep doing this forever, but like, just for today, I'm going to take my walk. Just for today. Like, and so again, you're doing all this mental trickery so that you can maneuver and manipulate your own motivation. And that is what highly successful people do. All of the very successful people, the happy and productive people that I study, are like kind of, bartering with themselves, like tricking themselves, like, putting the Halloween candy in the freezer so they don't eat it. Like, like knowing that if they call their friend and say, I'm going to meet you tomorrow for a walk, knowing that if I do that, I won't be able to get out of it. Right. So it's all this kind of, almost like manipulation of yourself in order to like keep your motivation as consistent as possible. Again, knowing that of course you're going to have some ups and downs, some good days and bad days, some good months and bad months. But I think if any of these tricks resonate with you, or if you have your own tricks, right? Like keeping your sneakers out, or like, putting on Facebook, like whatever goal it is that you have to like, get some public accountability from your friends and family, all those tricks are part of what very productive and successful people do. So keep doing them, and always keep your eyes out for more tricks.
Yeah. I love the Seinfeld reference. Lee, if you could look up, so if you Google don't break the chain, Jerry Seinfeld, you can get the PDF. I actually have it next to my treadmill. I love it. I'm like, oh my gosh, let me check that off. Like, I do not want to see something. So definitely you can download that PDF, put it somewhere. And then we're doing a EVCC challenge coming up in July, and we started it last year because of the pandemic, and it's a whole month. And this whole thing about putting something on Facebook or telling people your goal is a really great way. And that community is super fun and super engaging. So if you're looking to kind of get started, that's a really great opportunity to do that.
And very recent research looked at all of the, goals are a really important way that human beings motivate themselves. When's the last time you decided to do something hard without setting a goal, right? Like goals are magical. And to your point, Mel, like when we publicly announce them, so it's not a private goal, but like you tell someone, you tell your spouse, you tell your daughter-in-law, you post it on Facebook, you tweet it, like that has been shown scientifically to increase the effectiveness of goals. So it's a way of like turbocharging your goals by going and telling everybody what you're doing.
Yeah, it's also really interesting because I'll find myself like I'll set a goal in my head. And I'll be like, oh my God, I'm gonna tell somebody. And then I get scared and I'm like, oh God, if I can't tell them, because then I have to do it. It really makes a difference. So if you're one of those people that likes to get that accountability, and also just like you need a little, come on, you can do it. It's a good way to do it. I wanna talk a little bit about, so the passion and perseverance piece.
Yeah.
It's tough, right? So some people they love exercising. They're like, oh, I've actually been doing this all along, and thank God it helps people with Parkinson's because I'm already doing it. Some people, no, that's not what they do. They never have liked it. They might call themselves, they might identify as somebody who hates exercising. How do you get those two to work when the passion when the passion's not there?
When it doesn't come naturally,
Yeah.
And you like have to do it. It's a should, not a want. Well, one of the things about the gritty women and men that I study, usually in a different context, right? Like, who won the National Spelling Bee? Like, who graduates from West Point? Without exception, I found that there is intrinsic motivation for things that you're really passionate about. So to your point, Mel, like it's so much easier when you want to study biology and then you have to study biology. It's like, now Parkinson's is a different beast because it happens to you and you may not have chosen, the routines that you need to adopt, like once having that diagnosis. I think of my dad actually, who never loved exercise, didn't grow up exercising. He was not of that generation. Anyway, he grew up in China in the 1930s and nobody was on a treadmill then, I'm pretty sure. And I think one thing that he could have done differently is now backed up by science, which is that when we think of things that we should do, like I should take a walk, I should eat this, I should not eat that, or we tend to spontaneously think of like, well, because it's going to make me healthy, and you think of like the long term and the future, but that's not actually very motivating, right? So if you say to me like, hey, like here's a salad, like, if you eat this salad, like maybe there's this like very small chance that you'll live like a little bit longer and a little healthier, like that does not make me want to eat the salad like at all, right? But if you make the salad delicious and motivating immediately, that's the way to get me to eat the salad. So the question is, how can you make exercise fun, right? So some people love all forms of exercise. God bless them, right? Like, but you might not be that way, but there might be something that you like more than others. One thing my dad didn't do was like, when he realized he needed to exercise, like he was like, oh, I guess I'll go to the gym and I'll get a trainer, which he did, but he never loved it and he didn't even like it. And so it was always a kind of like, well, I guess I'll do it. And he didn't do it very much. Was there a form of exercise that my dad would have enjoyed more? Now thinking back, I think like one of the things that we really enjoyed doing together was just taking walks around the neighborhood and like talking about like philosophy or whatever. And probably it would have been better for me or to him to say like, let's take a walk every day and talk about current events and history. And so like that would have been more motivating and more fun for him, more intrinsically motivating, more immediately gratifying than like, oh, I guess I'll go to the gym because like that's, like good for me. So I guess the moral of the story here is whatever it is that you need to do, that you should do, can you, again, through this like mental trickery or just through like strategic choices, find a way to do that is immediately gratifying. And one way to like say it in 3 words is make it fun, right? And I don't think human beings are very good at doing things over the long term that aren't in some ways immediately fun for them.
Right. Yeah. So the one, like we've had several people that have kind of gone down the road of like, oh, I was told to exercise, I don't like it. And they kind of try all the things. They run, they ride their bike, they go to boxing. And lots of people landed on something like dance, where it was actually not something they ever did. And now they dance every day. And so, and there's that saying, and I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something like, it's not what you do once in a while, it's what you do every day, I'm butchering it. But the whole thing is like, in your dad's case, it probably would have been better to go walking every single day than it was to go to the gym twice.
Very occasionally go to the gym and like work out with a trainer.
Right. So
yeah, no, you're totally right. I mean, from a physical standpoint, for sure, but also from a behavioral standpoint, right? So as a psychologist, I will say that things that we do twice a week or 3 times are actually in some ways harder for us to do psychologically than things that we do every day, right? I mean, for example, I think we all brush our teeth. I was hesitating there for a moment, but assuming that you brush your teeth every day, you don't wake up and think, should I brush my teeth today? Oh, what the heck, sure. Like you're not torturing. It's like you do it every day as a matter of habit, and habits generally, which is basically your brain's on autopilot, right? You don't even think about it. You just do it. It's like they're much easier to create when they're like every single time, you do the same thing, as opposed to sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. So physically, I'm sure you're right, Mel, but also psychologically, it's easier to do things where like you can become a daily routine.
Yeah, because the minute you have to like kind of shift your schedule around, you're like, oh, Thursdays I go here. It's like another decision and
you're thinking, and the secret to habits is not thinking. Actually, when you do something that's a habit, you're not thinking at all. You're doing it. And I think for many of us, we would love to wave a magic wand and have an exercise habit. It's like, wouldn't that be great if like, without even realizing it, you're suddenly exercising? Like, so to get closer to that, make it a routine and make it something which again is extremely regular. So if you look at people who are writers, let's say novelists, right? Novelists as a rule, Stephen King or whoever, they don't like wake up and think, when am I going to write today? They have a routine where they do it every day, the same place. So, when 9 o'clock rolls around, like that's your routine. You don't even have to think about it. You're a little bit on autopilot. So it's going to take some experimentation. And there's also research showing this too. But it takes a while to kind of figure out like what your routine should be. You're going to try dance. Maybe you love it. Maybe you don't love it. You're going to try the gym. Maybe you love it. Maybe you don't love it. Like, and you have to have some flexibility always. Like I had a daily walking routine myself, and then February came with all the bad weather, so I had to adjust. But generally, if you think of it as, how can I experiment to find something which could become a daily routine and just ride that routine as far as and then, when needed, be flexible and experiment again. But I think that's my prescription for, how to get something like exercise, like into your life.
Yeah. So that piece about not thinking is almost like if you wake up in the morning and you start to ask the question, like just no, I don't get to like, I don't even get to ask it. I'm just gonna do it.
You're just doing. Yeah,
Yeah.
doing is better than thinking when it comes to habits.
Yeah. Yeah. So a little bit about that. Well, first of all, you said that when you were young, your dad said, and you were like, oh, let me prove them wrong. Like on some level, you had an interest, obviously, in achievement, because you went down that path. But like when it came to that, and then when it comes now to behavior change, like how long does it take? What are the things? I mean, you can set up the triggers, you can set up the schedule, but like how long does it typically take?
So when scientists have studied the habits like eating fruit in the afternoon or exercising or taking, 7,000 steps a day or whatever it is that people are trying to do, they've asked the question, like, how many days does it take to form a habit? And when you Google this, you can find, I'm sure Lee could find like every possible estimate, like 28 days, 60 days, 66 days. Right? And it turns out that there is no magic number for habits. So all of those numbers on the internet are wrong. There is no single number. It varies widely by person and also by habit type. The more complex and effortful the habit, and exercise, I think, falls into this category, the longer it takes. It's certainly not a matter of days. It's probably a matter of months. When you talk about a real exercise habit, that's data that I've been collecting with my collaborators. Nobody forms an exercise habit in 11 days. But over the course of months, and again, it varies by the individual, like, yes, you can start to become sort of automatically, habitually an exerciser. I do think, though, that one thing you want to keep in mind is that this development of kind of like, oh, it's automatic, I don't even think about it. The thing I do like about these numbers is that when you do Google it, they do usually give you big numbers. And I do think that having a sense that you shouldn't expect on day 12 to wake up and like, well, why don't I have an exercise habit? It's like, are you kidding? It takes months to develop that. So give yourself a break while you are getting to be a more consistent exerciser. And frankly, there are a lot of people who exercise their whole lives and it never becomes truly a habit. It never becomes truly like autopilot, second nature, and everything. They just have like lots and lots of tricks. It's like, I have an exercise buddy and I buy really nice workout clothes and I put my sneakers by the front door so I don't forget, and I put it on my Google Calendar, and I, keep signing up for classes that I like more. I mean, those people are never really habitual exercises, but they're very successful.
Yeah, I love that point. So one of the ways that you could maybe try it is maybe borrow the perseverance of somebody else. So if you've got somebody they're like, oh my gosh, I just know Rich gets up and does this every single day. How can I get on his like bandwagon? Maybe I can meet him for a workout and kind of borrow that for a while until it becomes that way for you. So it's another little
absolutely trick. And the givers among you, which I think you'll reckon, like, if you're like a real giver and you just like, there's nothing that gives you more energy than actually helping another person. The way my mom, who is still with us and she's 86, I think the way that she gets her steps in, when she was taking care of my dad, he lived like at the opposite end of the nursing facility. So she just got her steps in, like walking, I think, to his bedroom and like sometimes wheeling him around, et cetera. And then when he passed away, I noticed that my mom got like a lot less active because she wasn't taking care of my dad. But the thing that motivates my mom is actually taking other people in the nursing facility for a walk. So there's like nothing so whatever makes you tick, right? If you're kind of like, oh, I love conversation, like I'll go with my best friend. If you're like, oh my God, I would hate that. Maybe you're the kind of person who gets motivated by a podcast, like, and then you want to just be by yourself listening to a podcast. So it's going to take some experimentation, but whatever it is that you need to figure out that makes it something which is immediately rewarding, because that's the other thing we didn't say about habit formation yet, Mel, and I think it's really important. Habits take repetition over many, many trials, many, many days, many, many months, probably, if it's talking about exercise. It's much better if it's really rhythmic. In other words, not 2 days a week, not 4 days a week, but 7 days a week, right? Just something really consistent. The other necessary feature of habit formation is it has to be rewarding. if you go to the gym again and again and again and again, and like my dad, you don't really ever enjoy it, it will never become a habit, no matter how long you go. So you have to experiment, find ways where you're like, oh, every time I get to listen to this podcast, and then that's a little reward for you. And that like, again, will like, over time strengthen the habit.
Right. Great. In your work at Character Lab, you talk about 3 dimensions of strength: heart, will, and mind. Having grit is having a strength of will. What does that look like in practice? Some of the things we talked about. What do gritty people say to themselves, or what do they do that non-gritty people don't tend to do?
And I know Lee, who I think I'm gonna just kidnap Lee, because I would love to have somebody in my life who just like looked up
Right?
everything immediately and sent me the link. But Lee can certainly chat the link to characterlab.org, where you can read more about this. But what grit looks like in adulthood is that you have something that just before we started here, Mel, you were just telling me, I was like, how did you get involved with the Davis Phinney Foundation? Like, and you were telling me the somewhat non-linear path that brought you here. But I will say that one of the ways that like grit sort of like shows up, and so it was like I could tell somebody's gritty, is that when they talk about their work, it is like talking about like a calling. Like it's like somehow it's interesting to them, but also it's meaningful in terms of enabling them to live out their values. Psychology is that for me, right? Like I got to be with you for an hour. Maybe some of the things I'm saying are helpful. That is like, living out my value of like, trying to be a helpful person in the world. But it's also super interesting. Like everything you're saying is interesting to me. These questions are interesting to me. So I think one of the ways that grit sort of shows up, or like what it looks like in adults, is that they're able to take their personal interests, psychology, writing, gardening, cooking, and then their values, right? Like fairness, social justice, benevolence, truth, honesty, whatever. And then if it's in the same thing, then people usually will say like, oh, it's like a calling for me, right? Like I feel like I was born to do this. That's passion. And then in terms of perseverance, there are 2 things that I look for when I look for perseverance in an adult, and there are versions of this in kids too. But just in an adult, it would say first, you would be this kind of resilience in the face of adversity, right? So somebody who falls down, but it tends to get up again and dust themselves off and feel like they can learn something from it. So that kind of resilience in the face of a diagnosis of Parkinson's or a more minor setback. I mean, that is a feature of perseverance. And last, I'll say that this second feature of perseverance is like a desire to always be improving. So there is a kind of, scientists call it deliberate practice, where you are always asking like, well, what's one thing I could do differently and better? So when I look at these Olympic athletes, they have an interest in their sport. If you're at the Olympic level, it's also an expression of your values. So it's not just fun. It's also like, like who you are and how you want to contribute to the world. You are resilient in the face of setbacks, losses, injuries, etc. And if you're an Olympic athlete, you're like not just going through practice like a mindless person. You're always like, what's one thing that I could do better? And just to model this for you, Mel, after this conversation, I, of course, will send you a note of gratitude for being such a gracious host. And I will ask you, like, what is one thing I could have done better in the email correspondence before this or during this conversation? And like, that is kind of what a gritty person would do, is to just, assume that no matter how good something is, like, there's something you can do. What's your advice for doing a little bit better in the future?
Yes, that is great. And I'm wondering about, one of the things that we have in our DNA as a foundation is Davis Phinney was an Olympic medalist. His wife, Connie Carpenter Phinney, was in the Olympic medalist as well. This foundation, one of our core values is Olympic level work, either Olympic level production of things, execution of things. The staff, we've taken this on, we talk about it as a thing. And I think it brings a lot of meaning to us when we are executing at an Olympic level, what we believe the standards are. When you combine that with meaning, something that's meaningful, you have this potential for a lot of downstream impacts. So you had somebody who's doing something meaningful we have a person, Wayne. He was an educator his whole life. He was a teacher and an artist, but he really got into poetry after he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. He did poetry in prisons for people in prison. He does poetry with people with Parkinson's. He teaches everywhere. He has little workshops, and it's very meaningful for him. That ability to give back in a meaningful way gives him so much energy that actually has downstream impacts on the rest of their life. So a lot of times when people are struggling with exercise or struggling to do something, it's this idea of how can I, like, giving back. It's kind of like when I go clean the fridge and then I clean my whole house. Once I give back in a certain way, I feel so good that then I go do other things. So it's another reason why grit is so important, and to be able to like find something that you love, and it may, trickle down to the rest of your life.
There were some thinkers like Freud who really thought that like human beings were primarily driven by pleasure, by selfish interest. And I think it's so obvious that most people are more driven by the need to be useful to other people, right? Like, what gets you up out of bed in the morning? Is it like because you want to eat like a really delicious breakfast, or would you be more like quick to jump out of bed if somebody that you love needed breakfast that you needed to make, right? So I think Freud was wrong about that. And if you can use that to advantage, right? So when we talk about things like taking care of yourself, eating the right way, exercising, if we put all of the burden on like, that's because you will live a better life, it's for your health, you're like, but it's like, how can I think of it as a way of being helpful to other people? Because if I'm healthier and I'm in a good mood and I have energy, like everyone I love is going to have a better day. And also like even the immediate, like when I talked about my mom, getting all those steps in, still doing that, right? Because like, she gets to walk somebody who, really needs assistance, and like they need to get their steps in. Oh my gosh, that is 10,000 times more motivating to my mom than like, oh, you'll have an enjoyable walk, right? So again, if that resonates with you, then just think of it as like a challenge of like, how do you creatively harness this need for purpose that you have, which is a wonderful thing, by the way, and a much, more accurate view, I think, of like true human nature.
Yeah, so that makes me think of our care partners. I know we have a lot of care partners on the phone or on the line. And one of the issues that a lot of care partners face is they really want their person with Parkinson's to live well. And they are reading and learning and doing all of the things, and they know what it would take for their person with Parkinson's to live well, and that person won't take action. So they are frustrated. They're willing to do whatever it takes. They will say, "Oh, I will schedule this with you. I will go and I will do that." What can they do? They might have all the grit in the world, but how do they do that? And at what point do you just say, "I can't do it"?
Okay, so two quick responses to a really meaningful question, which has like requires a much longer response than what I'll say here. But one is I do think at some level, so I'll have two things to say, but the first one is to say, like, at some level you can't fully control another person's motivation. And as my own therapist said to me once, you have to part of being mentally healthy is to let go of like this illusion that like if you do and say all the right things, then this other human being is going to feel a certain way. But you can't control other people. They're not like your elbow or your wrist. It's like, they're a whole other person. So I do think there are limits to what we can do. And I think that was really important for me to like just realize that. It didn't actually make me not try. It just made me try in a more sane way, right? It's like, oh, okay, right, there are limits. I can't fully control anybody else. So that's one thing I'll say. The second thing is in clinical psychotherapy, therapists have to handle this like all the time. And so what do, right? You have a depressed patient who comes in, and that if they do the following exercises, or if they, take a walk that day, like, they're going to get, but they won't do it. Like, what do you do? Like, they are not motivated to change. So one of the things that a cognitive therapist named David Burns developed is like a way of like externalizing the resistance, he calls it. So what he does is that he actually does something paradoxical. So you could imagine you're trying to get your partner to exercise, and you just know that the whole day is going to go better if they would just take a 5-minute walk, because also the 5-minute walk would probably end up becoming longer, because like once you get all these things, but your partner really doesn't want to go, and they're just like, no, I just don't want to go. So you do something non-intuitive, which is you say like, oh, so you don't want to go? No, I don't want to go. Great. Tell me all the reasons why you don't want to go. Like, let's make the case that you should definitely not go. You're like, well, it's cold outside. I'm really exhausted. Like, I didn't sleep well last night. Like, I'm really comfortable here. If I stay here, I can watch my Netflix show. Like, great. And you essentially like lay this all out. And then you just sort of like advocate for all these things. You're right. This Netflix special is going to be great. Like, it is pretty cold outside. I don't really, And what happens is that very often, at least in clinical therapy, the patient, now that you're their ally and you're like pushing like in the same direction, they have nothing to push. Like, they don't have an adversary anyway. And then they're like, well, I mean, it is cold outside, but we could wear a jacket, right? Like, they start advocating like, yeah, the Netflix special is great, but it's Netflix, so we could watch it when we get back. In other words, sometimes when we're pulling against somebody, like we're pulling this way, what do people do? They pull the other way, right? We like turn around and we just like go on the same side as them, and like they don't no longer have this thing that they're resisting. So he calls it externalizing the resistance, and you can Google David Burns, and I think he has a podcast.
He already put it up. She's got it.
Oh, there you go, because it's Lee. So again, I think those two things are things to keep in mind. Yeah, there are tricks that you can use, strategies, but also I think recognizing you're a human being and the other person is another human being, and you cannot fully control their motivation.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes it's just, you get out there, you do what you're going to do, and, let's do it. One of the interesting thing that happens with a lot of people with Parkinson's is apathy. And
which is part of the pathology of it, right? With the dopaminergic. Yeah. System.
Yeah. And one of our doctors are always like, apathy is the toughest one, because the struggle for the care partner, but the person with Parkinson's doesn't care because they're apathetic. They literally, by definition, do not care. And so one of the things that you can do is plan the day for them. So you just are like, have the things scheduled. Hey, we're going to do this. And they might not even fight you because they don't even.
That's interesting. Yeah, well, that generally works with most people, but I can see why it would especially work for Parkinson's. Like, behavioral scientists sometimes call this the power of defaults, right? The power of like, it's like if you're at a restaurant and there's the sort of like, well, most people order this. It's like, well, do you just order that, right? It's just like, you could change it, but like it's the default. This is how retirement savings programs work. It's like, the box is already checked off for you to contribute to retirement fund. You can uncheck it, but and we get these advertisements all the time. It's already checked off. Do you want to receive our newsletter? Checked. It's already checked. You could uncheck it. So the idea of planning somebody else's day, which is like with you're sort of like, well, the plan is like at 8:00 we're going to take a walk, and then at 8:30 we're going to have breakfast, and then it's not impossible to change, but then like people very often just gravitate to what already is. And I can see, given dopamine and all of that, like why this would be especially helpful with Parkinson's. And my dad was this way too, right? Like, it wasn't like my dad was like, hey, I really want to take a walk around the block. Like, so yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah. So somebody says, are there additional strategies you would recommend people with Parkinson's use to maintain grit despite symptoms of depression and apathy? I would say depression right now, especially for people who might not have a care partner to help them out.
Yeah, that is an important question, right? Because not everyone is lucky enough to have somebody on this call, for example, who is like taking notes and following web links from Lee. So I will say that the idea of intrinsic motivation, which we talked about, Mel, is also important to anyone. Maybe especially important to somebody who is suffering from depression, or like managing a chronic disease like Parkinson's. And by that I mean what it is that gives you energy is something to then double down on, right? So what human interests are, like, for example, like we all can for a moment right now think about the things that we find interesting. Like you and I, Mel, are like, oh, psychology, like motivation, so interesting. Maybe a lot of you feel that way as well, but not everyone. Other people might be like, oh, current events, politics in the United States, like super interesting. For others, less, right? Some people are like, oh, airplanes, like super interesting, or like, the history of World War II, or whatever it is, cooking, gardening. I think that the definition of a human interest is that subject which gives us energy and spontaneously grabs our attention. And some subjects will do it more than others. And just that little bit of introspection, right? Like I hate thinking about finances and money and taxes. And I also hate thinking about, honestly, current events. I don't like spontaneously want to ever talk about them. My husband likes all those things, which is good because we can divide up. But like for me, then, if I were dealing with, depression or lack of energy, Parkinson's, then it would be really important for me to say, like, well, how can I get more of these energy giving, attention grabbing things in my life? Like, how can I rearrange my day so that there's more of the stuff that I enjoy, that I care about, that kind of give me a little bit of a lift? And how can I, delegate this other stuff to other people? Now, again, that would be true for all of us, but maybe especially, for those who are struggling in the ways that you described.
Right. One of the topics that you and Stephen Dubner talked about that I always find super interesting is this idea of motivation. And you've said it a couple of times. And I think a lot of people do wait to get motivated. It's like, it's going to come. I'm going to get just hit by this bullet of motivation. What is your take on motivation?
So one of the things that makes human beings different from all the other animals on the planet is that we have metacognition. In other words, like animals have feelings and they have thoughts too, but only human beings have thoughts about their thoughts. It's like we don't think that chipmunks and squirrels and dogs are like, I was sad. What does it mean that I was sad? Why was I sad? I mean, they can feel sad, but they can't feel thoughts and feelings about their. Now, this metacognition, right, this uniquely human faculty enables us to manipulate ourselves in that way. So motivation is very important for you to take a kind of metacognitive, proactive, agentic, I don't have to just let my motivation ebb and flow as it will. I can maneuver it myself. I can, in a metacognitive way, realize that I'm really cranky and tired today, and I can do something about it. I can, I think I heard a podcast where somebody said that if I think of 3 good things in my life, 3 blessings, it should lift my mood. Maybe I'll try that. Let me try it. Okay, let's see. My daughter Lucy is the nicest person in the world. I had a delicious breakfast with a miraculously ripe avocado. Can never get the ripeness right, but today it was perfect. And I listened to this Beatles song that I hadn't heard in a million years, and that was just great. And I love the Beatles, right? Now how do I feel? Actually, I feel like a little bit better. Wow, that's weird. That kind of worked. That's metacognition. You're realizing that you feel a certain way, energetic, not energetic, tired, bored, interested, and then you do something about it in a proactive way. And I do think that's why, in part, human beings have become such a, dominant creature on the planet. It's it's a very powerful thing that you can manipulate your own mental state. And chipmunks and dogs and squirrels and fish and raccoons and even dolphins can't do that. So that is why I think this conversation to me, Mel, is so important, because if you got anything out of this conversation, if it just gave you one idea or one moment of reflection where you got to see yourself a little bit more clearly, then you are doing metacognition right now. And I think that that's kind of if you can do that, you can kind of solve your problems, because it's a way of constantly improving on how you're functioning.
Yeah. And I think one of the things right there is when you're thinking about it, one of the ways to move from the thinking to the behavior is to not judge or like put a preference on what the thought is. So you might have said, I'm not feeling energetic. And instead of going down the path of like, I'm going to judge that, I'm going to give it a preference,
I'm a bad person.
or good. It's just like, oh, I'm noticing it. I'm going to go do something else. Like, I think that you don't have, right? You don't have to believe every thought you think.
Don't have to reflexively evaluate. So let me just say a couple words on that. So I'm sure everybody here has heard of mindfulness, and I'm sure many of you have practiced mindfulness, and some of you might be like, very, very, veteran mindfulness practitioners. But for those of you who know less about mindfulness, one of the key elements of any contemplation practice, there are lots of varieties of this, is a non-judgmental awareness of the present. So like, why is that important? Well, if I am like somebody who like just eats a whole pint of Ben and Jerry's ice cream and then I feel guilt, right? A mindful approach to that would just to notice that you feel guilty. Like, I notice that I feel guilty, or I notice that I ate a pint of ice cream, or without it kind of spiraling into like a very judgy sort of like, oh my God, that's terrible, and I'm a really bad person, etc. So mindfulness is being able to be somewhat distanced, like as if you were a sort of a neutral observer. It's like, oh, I noticed that I ate a pint of ice cream. I noticed I did that because I was stress eating. Like, I noticed that, right? It's like having a remove. And the reason why this is such an important part of mindfulness practice is because what the brain and mind spontaneously do is evaluate and judge. So we have a very strong bias to be very judgy. Like, was that good or was it bad? Am I a good person or am I a bad person? Like, and mindfulness is a practice of like tamping down that reflexive like thing, because just as you say, Matt, like when we attach a judgment, a strong evaluation, especially the negative ones, the self-critical ones, onto things, we could just spiral into these extremely unproductive kind of like self-critical loops. And I will just say, when I was in my 20s, I'm like a 51-year-old who I remember when I was in my 20s, I would literally say things like, I'm bad, I'm bad, I'm bad. And I'm like, now I think back and I'm like, dude, I should have like, what the hell? It's like, oh, I ate 2 apples instead of 1. I'm bad. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, so I do think having this non-judgmental remove is the name of the game. It's not easy to do, which is why all the mindfulness practitioners you can chat right now, but like, you don't like become a mindfulness, maestro in a day or two, but you can over time learn to remove. And if you can even just use this language, like, I noticed, like, that's very helpful because it's already distance. Like, I noticed I was in a terrible mood today. I noticed I was not very nice to the telemarketer who got, just like, instead of like immediately attaching all of that judgment. I think that'll be helpful.
Yeah, it's part of like when we give advice to people. One of the reasons like we're able to give advice is we have that psychological distance. We got to create it for our own self by doing some of those practices that you talked about. So
I'll just add this. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I can't resist when you say that we need, when I give advice to someone else, I have psychological distance. Like, I have tons of psychological distance on this call because I'm just dispensing advice left and right. But then in my own life, it's hard. But here's a trick. And actually people like LeBron James use this because, there's so much recorded footage. Many high performing people will literally say they'll use you in the same, it's like, LeBron has actually said things like, LeBron, what should LeBron do right now? Should LeBron leave this team and go to another team? And he has said this, like, you recorded footage. And you could, if I were having like a really stressful emotion, it'd be like, Angela, okay, we got to get our head on straight. Angela, and actually you could use you instead of what should you do? Should you say yes to this engagement, or should you say no? So sometimes you can even just use language to distance yourself. And if you want to Google that, and if you want a book on that, Ethan Kross with a K, and he wrote a book called Chatter, and it's all about how to use, these self-talk techniques that have been studied in and out of clinical therapy as ways to more productively, distance yourself than we sometimes do on our own.
Yeah. And like the same thing around like that, an alter ego. Like if you have to have like somebody who's an athlete or maybe a performer on some level, like I always feel like, well, Melanie wouldn't do that, but I like whoever my alter ego's name is, she would do that. So what would she do?
Yeah.
So you can look at that as well. And for some people, they just create the alter ego of somebody that they admire, and they say like, what would so and so do right now? And we can get ourselves.
I'm sure
there.
what would Beyonce do has been uttered in the private
Right?
minds of millions of people, probably even within the last day. So,
Right.
I think
here we can say, what would Davis Phinney do? Like Davis Phinney would get up, he would go ride his bike, he would go take a walk, he would smile because he's got the best smile, and he would say, I love vacuuming, right? Like that's what Davis would do. And so we always have that as well. I wish we had 7 more hours to talk about this. I'm so grateful for you being here today and for taking the time out of your very busy day. I hope summer has started and you have a little less of a crazy schedule with your students. And everybody check out Angela Duckworth. You can go to angeladuckworth.com, characterlab.org. And then we also have, you can take out your gritty, how gritty are you, by going to the scale. And I think that we put that up already, but we'll send it as well. And then her TED Talk. So Angela, thank you so much for being here. So grateful.
Thank you. I'm grateful as well, and I hope we get to have another conversation. And thank you for everybody for joining us for this last hour. You are very busy people, so I'm appreciative of your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye bye.